So friends, with just 22 words, we could actually make inroads into improving ethics in our federal government. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, here's part 3 of my recent interview with former Inspector General Bob Westbrooks, and this episode is near and dear to my heart because Bob and I talk about 22 words. 22 words that should be added to the oath of federal office, 22 words that would turn every single federal employee into a mandatory reporter of crime and corruption in the federal government, a mandatory whistleblower, if you will. Those 22 words: that I will promptly report all instances of crime and or corruption by government officials and employees of which I become aware. Just 22 words added to the oath of office. Friends, this is a call to action. Let's do this. Here is part 3 of my chat with Bob Westbrooks. I am forever talking about when it comes to the need for what I call a renaissance of ethics in government, and it's basically a harebrained scheme, which is most of my schemes are harebrained schemes, to try to find a way to turn everybody in the federal government, everybody in federal service, into a whistleblower, in essence. How effective do you think our current whistleblower system, program, procedures are when it comes to not only putting the tools in place to encourage people to report fraud, waste, abuse, corruption in the federal government, but then protecting them once they do? How effective is our whistleblower system in your experience as a longtime IG?
The system as a whole is relatively sound. And I say that from the perspective of I've managed the hotline in a number of organizations, and there are many cases that never make the news where somebody comes to the hotline and says, I want to report this bad behavior. And by statute, the IGs can afford them confidentiality if they so wish, or you have mechanisms by which they can report something anonymously, and even the IG doesn't know who they are. The problem is when you have these big prominent cases, and you mentioned a couple of them early on with Vindman and Michale Atkinson and the like, and there are others. In a sense, you almost have to judge the whole system by those anomalies, because every whistleblower deserves to be protected, even if the information they have turns out to be wrong or incomplete. You want to create an environment where they have a safe place and a channel to report that. And critically important is that they're free from retaliation if they do. And you hate to see it. Unfortunately, we saw it at the highest levels of government, right? In the last administration. But there are sanctions in place in law. So your run-of-the-mill federal manager, if they retaliate against a whistleblower, will be sanctioned, and sanctioned hard. With that said, though, Glenn, one thing that is undeniable as well. So I think the system, the legal construct needs some tweaking, but it's fundamentally sound. And I do think we need to incentivize reporting, and not just incentivize, but maybe a backstop, and make it more of a, hey, wouldn't this be nice if you reported this, but more in the form of an obligation and part of your oath. The reality is, even when you have a sound system, the reality is I've seen too many instances where it's not easy and convenient for whistleblowers to come forward. So I would give them the same talk when somebody would come in and share information with me. I would tell them, thank you for doing this as a career public servant to another public servant. Thank you for doing this, because I know it's incredibly brave to do it. I also want to tell you that you may well be in for a rough road. I don't want to lie to you and say that just because the law says nobody will find out your identity from my office, I can assure you of that. But just based upon interviews and conduct that happens, circumstances in the office, somebody may find out. And when they do find out, things are going to be different for you. And that's unavoidable. And that's so unfortunate. And it's so wrong. I've yet to find a whistleblower that says they came out totally unscathed, and that most are glad they did it. They feel like this was the righteous fight, but everybody pays a little price, and maybe it's too big of a price in our system.
Yeah, and there is no answer to this question, but I think it is the question that is most enlightening in a horrific way. How many whistleblowers were deterred by what Donald Trump did to Michale Atkinson and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, he said, as his blood pressure went up again? It is that experience that sort of prompted me to begin one of my harebrained schemes when it comes to, making whistleblowing not this magical unicorn situation where people feel like they're going to pay so dearly if they expose fraud, waste, abuse, crime, and corruption within the federal government, because they're going to be tomorrow's Colonel Vindmans, and make it not only the expectation, not only the culture, but the absolute obligation when you decide you want to take the oath of office and become a public servant as a federal government employee. So, Bob, you and I have both taken the oath many times. 70 words in the federal oath that is set out by law in the statute that we all have to take when we embark on federal service. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. 70 words. Why can't we add 22 by statute? Amending a statute is not a difficult proposition unless you have a dysfunctional Congress. And I propose that we add these 22 words at the appropriate place in the oath, that I will promptly report all instances of crime and or corruption, we could add fraud, waste, and abuse, by government officials and employees of which I become aware. If it's everybody's sworn duty to report, why shouldn't it be our collective responsibility to do everything we can to ensure honest government? I don't understand what the principled opposition to this is. And you and I both know, Bob, this will not inspire everybody to actually do what they have pledged in their oath of office to do. But if they know every single person around them is a mandatory reporter and may take their oath of office more seriously than the wrongdoer, man, will that have potentially a deterrent effect government-wide. So you actually went there a few minutes ago, but I would love for an IG's perspective, a career IG's perspective on just how much of a harebrained scheme this is and how much it not only kind of fits the bill of what might help give a rebirth of ethics in government, but what in the world are the prospects of making this a reality?
Yeah. So let me tie a couple of concepts together that popped into my head when you talked about that. The first is, I used to say when I was in the executive director role, when I would give talks, I was like, we're not just living through a public health crisis, we're living through a public trust crisis. Mm-hmm. And part of that was, at that time, was the disinformation regarding both the nature of the threat of COVID and also the efficacy of public health measures. I'm like, God help us the next time, man. We don't share the common facts anymore, right? We've lost the common sense and the sense of common good. So I believe, right, we have this public trust crisis. And it's not just America. You see this now, like, in top of mind. I'm doing some work now overseas, and you've got Ukraine in the battle for its existence with Russia, and one of the principal objections to giving more aid to Ukraine is perceived corruption within that government. And it's all over the world. Is this, corruption indexes are governments living up to their duty of public trust. So I do believe that there needs to be demonstrable change in this regard. And another piece I want to tie into this was one of the more maddening and frustrating observations of mine out of the pandemic fraud crisis, the largest public fraud in American history, is what I call the problem of low-grade fraud. We've seen clusters of employees, public employees at the city level, county level, state level, and federal level, clusters of employees that engaged in pandemic fraud. That many of them are not being prosecuted because they weren't hardened criminals that were seeking $1 million. Their fraud was to the tune of $25,000 or $21,000 that, a very busy federal prosecutor in a very busy district may not take that case, right? And is likely not going to take it. So sometimes these folks are being fired. Sometimes they're not being fired. We had this public trust crisis where we had this fraud crisis actually filtered down to public employees. So I do believe you have to take demonstrable action, right? And one of the things to do is it going to incentivize a huge number of people that you can quantify to come forward? Maybe, maybe not. But where's the harm? And the beautiful thing, Glenn, and I think you sort of implied this here, but I know from my perspective in the jobs where I've taken the oath of office, there's that little bit of a lump in the throat moment, right? It's your first day on the job and usually a very boring day, but there's that lump in the throat like, yeah, I'm wearing the white hat. I'm doing the right thing in this job. And if you plant that seed in the very beginning, you never know when it's going to grow. So I think I just don't see the harm.
Yeah, I don't see the harm. And I will continue pushing the rock up the hill and trying to find a member of Congress. I've reached out to lots of them, and I think I've been a little emboldened because my first crack at federal legislation, as soon as I retired from the Department of Justice in 2018, was trying to get homicide families some statutory help, some legal rights to have their loved one's murder case reviewed and reinvestigated once it grew cold. And I had the good fortune of being able to convince Representative Eric Swalwell, himself a former prosecutor, that this was kind of a good and necessary thing. And last year, President Biden signed into law the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act, which we're now in the process of pushing out to all 50 states. And 250,000 families whose loved one's murder case is unsolved now will begin to have some hope that at least it will be given a relook and perhaps a reinvestigation. So emboldened by that, I am now trying to push this rock up the hill, and I value any help, wisdom, or direction or introductions you can give me, because this is something that I think has at least the prospect of changing the culture.